The gunshot cracked through the crisp morning air, sending a flock of startled birds into the Montana sky as Catherine Rose clutched her bleeding shoulder and stumbled behind a weathered boulder. It was 1885, and she was miles from civilization with a bullet wound, an empty canteen, and a band of outlaws closing in on her father's ranch, the ranch they'd now claim was theirs, along with her father's grave. Catherine winced, pressing her handkerchief against the seeping wound. She had escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back, her mother's wedding ring, and the deed to the Rose family ranch hidden in her boot. Tears stung her eyes as she remembered her father's final words. "Run, Kathy. Don't let them take what's ours." The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent a fresh wave of panic through her body. Catherine peered around the boulder, expecting to see Jasper Quinn and his gang of cutthroats. Instead, a lone rider approached, his broad-shouldered silhouette backlit by the rising sun. She shrank back, heart pounding in her throat. "I know you're there," called a deep voice, neither threatening nor particularly friendly. "You're leaving a blood trail a blind man could follow." Catherine remained silent, clutching her father's old revolver. It had only one bullet left, one she'd been saving for Quinn if he caught up to her, but she'd use it on this stranger if needed. "I'm not with them," the voice continued, "but they'll be here soon enough if you don't let me help you." Taking a shuddering breath, Catherine stepped out from behind the boulder, gun raised. "Stay where you are." The man atop a magnificent chestnut stallion raised his hands slowly. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-weathered skin, intense green eyes, and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. A worn leather hat sat atop dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Name's Roy Archer," he said calmly, as if having a gun pointed at him was a common occurrence. "You're bleeding pretty bad, miss." "How do I know you're not one of Quinn's men?" Catherine demanded, though her arm was beginning to tremble from the effort of holding the revolver steady. "If I was with Quinn, there'd be a dozen men with me and we wouldn't be having this conversation." His eyes flickered to the horizon behind her. "And they're about half an hour behind me, so we're wasting precious time." Catherine wavered, her vision blurring slightly. The blood loss was taking its toll. "Why would you help me?" "Because contrary to what you might think of strangers in these parts, not everyone's a scoundrel." Roy dismounted in one fluid motion. "Now, are you going to let me take a look at that wound, or would you rather bleed out waiting for Quinn to find you?" She lowered the gun slightly. "My father's ranch, Rose Creek Ranch, I know it. News travels fast. James Rose was a good man." Roy approached her cautiously. "I'm sorry about your father." The sincerity in his voice broke something in Catherine. The gun dropped to her side as tears spilled down her cheeks. "They killed him in cold blood, said the land was rightfully theirs." Roy reached her just as her knees buckled. He caught her with strong arms, easing her to the ground. "Easy now, let me see that shoulder." As he gently pulled back the blood-soaked fabric, Catherine studied his face. There was something trustworthy in those green eyes, despite the dangerous competence in his movements. "Bullet went clean through," he said after examining both sides of her shoulder. "Lucky, still needs tending before infection sets in." He retrieved a small flask from his saddlebag, uncorking it with his teeth. "This'll hurt." The whiskey burned like fire as he poured it over the wound, and Catherine bit down hard on her lip to keep from screaming. Roy worked quickly, tearing strips from a clean bandana to bind the wound. "We need to move," he said, helping her to her feet. "My cabin's about 2 hours' ride from here." "Quinn and his boys won't find it," Catherine swayed, clutching his arm. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "Let's just say I've got no love for Jasper Quinn and his particular brand of justice." Roy helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Besides, a lady in distress is reason enough." As they rode away from the boulder, Catherine leaned back against his chest, too weak to maintain her posture. "I can't pay you," she whispered. "They took everything." "Wasn't asking for payment," Roy replied. his breath warm against her ear as he guided the horse into a steady gallop away from the approaching danger. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, with Catherine drifting in and out of consciousness. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the solid presence of Roy behind her kept her anchored to reality despite the pain and blood loss. When they finally stopped by a small creek to water the horse, Roy helped her down and insisted she drink. The cool water revived her slightly, bringing clarity back to her thoughts. "Quinn will burn down the ranch," she said, her voice hollow. "Everything my father built." Roy crouched beside her, refilling his canteen. "Quinn's been trying to get that land for years. Your father's water rights to the West Fork of the river are worth more than gold these days." "You knew my father?" Catherine asked, surprised. "Of him, everyone around these parts did." Roy handed her the canteen. "Drink more. We've still got a ways to go." Catherine took another sip, then reached for her left hand, twisting the gold band on her finger, her mother's wedding ring, the last thing she had of her. "I can't let them take the ranch. It's all I have left. One battle at a time, Miss Rose. First, we get you somewhere safe." When they mounted up again, Catherine felt marginally stronger. As they rode, Roy kept them off the main trails, weaving through dense pine forests and across shallow streams to mask their trail. "You know these mountains well," Catherine observed as they traversed a narrow ridge overlooking a sweeping valley below. "Been living up here 5 years now. Man gets to know the land when it's just him in it. No family," a pause. "Not anymore." There was a story there, but Catherine didn't press. They all had their ghosts in this unforgiving territory. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood, nestled between towering pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, which caught Catherine by surprise. "You said you lived alone," she said, tensing. "I do, but I've got a friend who checks in when I'm away." Roy dismounted and helped her down. "That'll be Mabel. She's harmless unless you're a rabbit in her garden." As if on cue, the cabin door opened, and an elderly woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her face lit up at the sight of Roy. "Wasn't expecting you back so soon." Mabel stopped when she saw Catherine, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "Good heavens, what happened?" "Quinn's men," Roy said simply, supporting Catherine as they approached. "Shot her trying to escape after they killed James Rose." Mabel's weathered face hardened. "Those devils. Bring her in quickly." The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable, a far cry from the bachelor quarters Catherine had expected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking pot simmering over the flames. Hand-carved furniture, including a table, chairs, and a bed in the corner, filled the space. "Set her down here," Mabel directed, clearing space on the bed. "I'll fetch my medicine box." As Roy eased her onto the soft quilt, Catherine clutched his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, the full weight of her ordeal finally crashing over her. "I would have died out there." Something flickered in Roy's eyes, compassion, perhaps, or recognition of a shared pain. "Get some rest, Miss Rose. You're safe now." For the first time since watching her father fall to Quinn's bullet, Catherine believed it might be true. Over the next 3 days, Catherine drifted between feverish dreams and moments of clarity. Mabel, who she learned was a widow from the nearby town of Pine Ridge, tended her wound with poultices and herbal teas, muttering about modern medicine being worth less than horse sense. Roy was often absent, returning at dusk with game for the table or news from town. On the 4th day, Catherine awoke feeling substantially improved, the fever finally broken. She pushed herself up against the pillows, taking in her surroundings with clear eyes. The cabin was simple but thoughtfully constructed, with small touches that spoke of care, carved wildlife figures on the mantel, colorful quilts, and a bookshelf stuffed with well-worn volumes. Through the window, she could see Roy chopping wood, his movements precise and powerful. Mabel entered carrying a steaming mug. "Ah, the color's back in your cheeks. Good sign." How long have I been here? Catherine asked, accepting the fragrant tea. 4 days. That shoulder was angrier than a wet cat for a while. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed. Roy's been worried, though he'd sooner bite off his tongue than admit it. Catherine's eyes drifted back to the window. He saved my life. That's his way, always bringing home strays though you're the first human one. Mabel's eyes twinkled. Usually it's injured wolves or hawks with broken wings. He mentioned he's been here 5 years. Mabel nodded, her expression growing somber. After the war. He came back different like many did, lost his wife and baby daughter to fever while he was fighting. Couldn't face staying in their home back east. Catherine's heart constricted. That's terrible. Life deals hard hands sometimes. Mabel patted Catherine's arm. Now, think you can manage some stew, you need your strength back. Later that evening, Catherine ventured outside for the first time, wrapped in one of Roy's spare shirts over her tattered dress. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. She found Roy sitting on a rough-hewn bench overlooking the valley below, a mug of coffee in his hands. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Roy looked up, surprise crossing his features before he nodded and shifted to make room. "Should you be up? Mabel says moving around will do me good." Catherine sat carefully, mindful of her bandaged shoulder. "She's gone back to town. She has her own place to tend to, said she'd be back in a few days to check on you." Roy offered her his mug. Coffee, she accepted, taking a small sip of the strong brew. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "I heard from town today," Roy finally said, his voice quiet. "Quinn's men have taken over your ranch. They're claiming your father sold it to them before his death." Catherine's fingers tightened around the mug. "That's a lie. My father would never sell to them. I have the deed," she stopped, suddenly remembering. "The deed is in my boot. I hid it there when they came." Roy's eyebrows rose. "Smart thinking. Fat lot of good it does me now." Bitterness crept into her voice. "Quinn has a judge in his pocket. Everyone knows it. Judge Wilson. He's corrupt as they come, but he's not the only law in the territory." Roy took the mug back, his fingers brushing hers. "The U.S. Marshal in Helena is a fair man. I could get word to him." Hope flickered in Catherine's chest, but she quashed it quickly. "Even if the marshal came, what proof do I have beyond my word against theirs? A piece of paper they'll claim is forged. We'll figure something out." Roy's calm certainty was oddly reassuring. "First, you need to heal completely." Catherine turned to him, studying his profile in the fading light. "I can't stay here indefinitely. I'm imposing on your kindness already." "You're not imposing." Roy met her gaze. "And you can stay as long as needed. I have nothing to offer in return." Catherine twisted her mother's ring, a nervous habit she'd developed. "I can't pay you for your trouble." Roy's eyes followed the movement, then lifted to meet hers. "Not everyone expects payment, Miss Rose." "Catherine," she corrected softly. "After pulling a bullet out of me, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Catherine, then, and the offer stands. Stay until you're well enough to fight for what's yours." That night, Catherine lay awake on Roy's bed. He had insisted on taking a bedroll by the fire, considering her options. Quinn would be looking for her, knowing she was the rightful heir to the property. Even with the deed, proving her claim would be difficult without witnesses to contradict Quinn's story of a legitimate sale. But for the first time since her father's murder, she felt a glimmer of hope. Roy Archer might be a stranger, but his quiet strength and unexpected kindness had become an anchor in her storm-tossed world. The following week brought steady improvement to Catherine's condition. The wound began to heal cleanly, and her strength returned enough for her to help with small chores around the cabin, preparing meals, mending clothes that Mabel had brought from town, and organizing Roy's surprisingly extensive book collection. She discovered he was well-read, with volumes ranging from practical guides on tracking and medicine to Shakespeare and Whitman. One afternoon, while Roy was hunting, she found a small, worn journal tucked between 2 books. She knew she shouldn't pry, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside were sketches, exquisite drawings of wildlife, landscapes, and occasionally people from town. The talent revealed in those pages surprised her. "My wife taught me," Roy said quietly from the doorway, making Catherine jump guiltily. Elizabeth was an artist. Catherine carefully closed the journal. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have looked." "It's all right." He set his rifle aside and hung up his hat. "Been a long time since I showed those to anyone. They're beautiful." She handed the journal back. "You capture the soul of things." Roy accepted the book, his fingers lingering on the cover. Elizabeth used to say that drawing something makes you truly see it. A sad smile crossed his face. "I still draw sometimes to remember how to see the world through her eyes." The vulnerability in his admission created a new bond between them. Catherine found herself sharing stories of her own, past of her mother who had died when she was 12, of learning to run the ranch alongside her father, of her dreams of someday turning part of their land into a horse breeding operation specialized in Appaloosas. "Father always said I had a way with horses," she explained one evening as they sat by the fire. "Even the most difficult ones would calm for me." "It's a gift," Roy agreed. "Animals know when someone understands them." "Quinn has our horses now too," Catherine said, the realization hitting her anew. "Beautiful animals. He'll probably sell them off to the highest bidder." Roy was silent for a moment, staring into the flames. "Word in town is that Quinn's planning to sell off parcels of your land to some eastern mining interests. They think there might be copper deposits on the North Ridge." "There aren't," Catherine said automatically. "Father had it surveyed years ago." "Plenty of good water and timber, but no significant minerals," she frowned. "But if Quinn's telling people there's copper—" "He's driving up the price," Roy finished, "making a bigger profit on land that isn't his to sell." Catherine stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. "I can't sit here any longer while he steals my father's legacy piece by piece. I need to do something." "You're still healing," Roy reminded her, though without much conviction. "Healing enough." Catherine faced him, determination hardening her features. "You said the U.S. Marshal in Helena is fair. Let's go to him." Roy studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "We'd need to be careful. Quinn has eyes everywhere between here and Helena." "I'm not afraid of Quinn," Catherine declared, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "You should be," Roy said quietly. "Men like him are dangerous precisely because they have nothing to lose and everything to gain." He stood, joining her by the fire. "But you're right, we can't wait forever." They made plans to leave for Helena in 2 days' time. Mabel, who returned the following morning with supplies, was skeptical of the journey but helped prepare by bringing Catherine proper clothes from town, a riding outfit that belonged to her late daughter, along with a heavy coat for the mountain passages. "The passes can be treacherous this time of year," Mabel warned as Catherine tried on the clothes. "Early snows come without warning." "We'll be careful," Catherine promised, touched by the older woman's concern. "And Roy knows these mountains better than anyone." Mabel's sharp eyes softened. "He's a good man, that one, been alone too long." She gave Catherine a meaningful look. Nice to see him caring about something again. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been very kind, MMM." Mabel's knowing smile spoke volumes. "Kindness is just the beginning, dear." That evening, as they finished preparations for the journey, Roy spread a map across the table, marking their planned route to Helena. "We'll avoid the main roads," he explained, tracing a winding path through the mountains. "It'll add a day to the journey but keep us clear of Quinn's men." Catherine leaned over the map, her arm brushing Roy's. "How long will it take?" 4 days if the weather holds." His voice had a slight rasp to it, and when Catherine glanced up, she found his eyes on her face rather than the map. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since that first day by the boulder. Catherine found herself unable to look away from his gaze, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. Roy cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early." Later, lying in bed listening to Roy's steady breathing across the room, Catherine touched her mother's wedding ring. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond vengeance and reclamation, a future that, surprisingly, included the quiet, strong man who had saved her life. They set out before dawn, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten. Roy had saddled both his chestnut stallion, Thunder, and a smaller bay mare he called Penny that he occasionally used as a packhorse. Catherine, dressed in Mabel's daughter's riding clothes and with her hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, looked every bit the seasoned rancher's daughter she was. "How does the shoulder feel?" Roy asked as he helped her mount, his hands lingering at her waist. "Stiff but manageable," Catherine replied, adjusting herself in the saddle. The wound had healed remarkably well under Mabel's care, leaving only a tender scar and occasional twinges of pain. They rode in companionable silence as the sun rose, following game trails through dense forest. Roy led the way, occasionally stopping to listen or check their surroundings. His caution reminded Catherine that they were, effectively, fugitives. "Tell me about Helena," she said during a brief rest to water the horses at a mountain stream. "I've never been." Roy leaned against a pine trunk, chewing on a piece of jerky. "It's growing fast." Gold and silver strikes brought the miners, but now it's becoming a proper city with banks, hotels, even an opera house. "An opera house," Catherine laughed. "In Montana Territory, progress marches on." Roy smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his face. "But don't worry, plenty of saloons and cowboys too, just with fancier hats." By midday, they had climbed considerably, the trail narrowing as it wound around a mountainside. Below them, the valley spread out in a patchwork of forests and meadows. In the far distance, Catherine could just make out smoke rising from what might have been her ranch. "That's Rose Creek," Roy confirmed, following her gaze. "Quinn's got men stationed all around it from what I hear." Catherine's hands tightened on the reins. "We'll get it back." "Yes, we will." The simple certainty in Roy's voice strengthened her resolve. They made camp that evening in a protected hollow, building only a small fire that wouldn't be visible from a distance. As they shared a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and coffee, Catherine found herself studying Roy's profile in the firelight. "You never told me why you were out riding the day you found me," she said suddenly. "Seems like fate you were there just when I needed you." Roy was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I'd been tracking Quinn's gang for a few days," he finally admitted, "after I heard what happened to your father." Catherine set down her tin cup. "Why?" "James Rose wasn't the first man Quinn's killed claiming disputed land rights." Roy's expression hardened. 3 years ago, it was my friend Thomas Wheeler and his family. Their ranch bordered Quinn's original property." "I remember that," Catherine said slowly. "Father said it was a tragedy, the house fire." "It wasn't an accident." Roy's voice was flat. "Quinn wanted Wheeler's water rights too. When Thomas refused to sell, Quinn's men burned the place down in the night. Thomas and his wife didn't make it out." Horror washed over Catherine. "You were friends with him. We served together in the war." Roy met her eyes, his own dark with old pain. "I'd been away hunting when it happened. By the time I returned, Quinn had already filed paperwork claiming Thomas had sold him the property before the accident. And no one questioned it." "Some did. They had accidents too." Roy tossed the stick into the fire. "Quinn's been building his empire piece by piece, and your father's ranch was his biggest target yet. The Rose Creek water rights would give him control of almost the entire watershed." Catherine processed this new information, pieces falling into place. "So when you found me?" "I'd been watching Quinn's men looking for evidence." Roy's mouth twisted in a grim smile. "Wasn't expecting to find you bleeding behind a boulder, but I'm glad I did. So am I." Catherine reached across the space between them, placing her hand over his. "Now I understand why you've helped me." Roy turned his hand to clasp hers. "It started as wanting to stop Quinn, yes, but now—" His voice trailed off, his eyes searching hers in the flickering light. "Now." Catherine prompted softly, "Now it's about more than vengeance." He squeezed her hand gently. "Now it's about you, Catherine." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within her. Impulsively, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, questioning, but Roy responded immediately, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. When they finally parted, Catherine felt breathless, her heart racing. "I shouldn't have, you should," Roy interrupted, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "You definitely should." They stayed that way for a long moment, foreheads touching, the world narrowed to just the two of them and the crackling fire. Eventually, practicality reasserted itself and Roy reluctantly pulled away. "We should rest," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "Long ride tomorrow." Catherine nodded, though sleep seemed impossible with the memory of his lips on hers. As they settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, she touched her mother's ring again, wondering what her parents would think of the man who had saved her life and was now stealing her heart. The next 2 days of travel brought them deeper into the mountains, following trails that sometimes seemed to exist only in Roy's memory. The weather held, though mornings dawned increasingly frosty as October tightened its grip on the high country. They encountered few travelers, an elderly trapper who shared his rabbit stew in exchange for coffee, and a small party of Salish Indians who nodded respectfully to Roy as they passed. Catherine noticed how he spoke to the Native Americans in their own language, earning smiles and information about the trails ahead. "You speak their language?" she asked after the encounter. "Some. Enough to be polite." Roy adjusted his hat against the strengthening wind. "People are people, Catherine. Treat them with respect. You usually get it back." It was these small moments that continued to reveal the complexity of the man who had rescued her, his fairness, his quiet competence, and his unexpected depths of knowledge and compassion. By the evening of the 3rd day, they had descended from the highest passes and could see the distant lights of Helena in the valley below. They made camp one last time, planning to ride into the city the following morning. As they sat beside their fire, the night unusually cold, Roy pulled a small flask from his saddlebag. "Special occasion," he explained, offering it to Catherine. "Last night on the trail." She accepted the flask, taking a small sip of smooth whiskey that warmed her from within. "Tomorrow we face the marshal," she said, passing the flask back. "What if he doesn't believe us? Marshal Donovan is a man who follows evidence, not rumors." Roy took a drink. "We have the deed, and I've been gathering accounts of Quinn's tactics for years. We have a chance." Catherine nodded, but worry still gnawed at her. "And if we succeed, what then?" Roy studied her face across the flames. "Then you get your ranch back, and you—" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. "I go where I'm needed," he said simply, but his eyes never left hers. "Where I'm wanted." Catherine held his gaze, summoning her courage. "And if you're wanted at Rose Creek Ranch," a slow smile spread across Roy's features, "then that's where I'll be." The promise in those words carried Catherine through the night, and into the next day as they rode into Helena, a bustling city that seemed impossibly large and chaotic after weeks in the mountain wilderness. Roy led them directly to the territorial courthouse, a grand stone building that intimidated Catherine with its formal facade. "You ready for this?" Roy asked as they tied their horses at the hitching post. Catherine straightened her shoulders, touching the deed secure in her pocket. "As I'll ever be." Marshal William Donovan proved to be exactly as Roy had described, a fair-minded, no-nonsense lawman with shrewd eyes and a methodical approach. He listened carefully to their story, examining the deed and taking notes as Roy produced his own documentation of Quinn's pattern of land seizures. "I've had my suspicions about Quinn for some time," the marshal admitted, "but witnesses have a way of disappearing when his name comes up." He looked directly at Catherine. "You're taking a considerable risk coming forward, Miss Rose." "My father was murdered," Catherine said firmly. "I won't let his killer profit from it." The marshal nodded slowly. "I'll need to verify some details and speak with Judge Wilson's superior in the territorial court." Can you remain in Helena for a few days? We can, Roy answered, his hand finding Catherine's under the table. Good, find lodging and keep your heads down. Marshal Donovan stood, signaling the end of their meeting. Quinn has friends in this city too. The less attention you draw, the better. They secured rooms at a modest hotel near the courthouse, adjoining rooms with a connecting door that they left slightly ajar by mutual, unspoken agreement. The comfort of a proper bed and hot bath was luxurious after days on the trail, though Catherine found the city's constant noise unsettling after the mountain silence. That evening, Roy insisted on treating Catherine to dinner at Helena's finest restaurant, a surprisingly elegant establishment with white tablecloths and actual silverware. She wore a dress Mabel had packed for her, a simple blue gown that nevertheless made Roy's eyes widen appreciatively when she emerged from her room. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm with formal courtesy that made her smile. Over dinner, they allowed themselves to set aside worries about Quinn and the ranch, instead sharing stories of their lives before fate had thrown them together. Catherine learned about Roy's childhood in Pennsylvania, his reluctant service in the war, and the joy he'd found in his brief marriage to Elizabeth before tragedy struck. "She would have liked you," Roy said, his expression softening with memory. "She was fearless too." Catherine blushed at the compliment. "I don't feel very fearless most of the time. Yet here you are, standing up to a man who's killed for less." Roy reached across the table to take her hand. "That's the definition of courage, Catherine, being afraid and doing what's right anyway." As they walked back to the hotel under a canopy of stars, Catherine felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. The city around them might hold dangers, but with Roy beside her, she felt oddly invulnerable. Their peaceful interlude was shattered the following morning. Catherine was awakened by urgent knocking, and she opened her door to find Roy fully dressed, his expression grim. "Quinn's in town," he said without preamble. "One of his men spotted us at the restaurant last night." Fear jolted through Catherine. "How do you know?" Marshal Donovan sent word. His deputy saw Quinn and 3 of his men arrive at dawn. Roy was already gathering their few belongings. "We need to move to a safer location." They left the hotel through the back entrance, following the marshal's instructions to a boarding house run by a retired lawman and his wife. The elderly couple showed them to a room in the attic with a view of the street below and promised their discretion. For 3 tense days, they remained in hiding while Marshal Donovan continued his investigation. Roy only ventured out after dark, returning with food, news, and increasing optimism. The marshals found 2 witnesses willing to testify that Quinn threatened your father, he reported on the 3rd evening. "Former hands from your ranch who saw the confrontation before the shooting, and Judge Wilson's clerk has admitted to falsifying land records in exchange for immunity." Hope bloomed in Catherine's chest. "So it's working. We can prove he stole the ranch. It's looking that way." Roy sat beside her on the small bed that dominated their attic room. "Marshall thinks he'll have enough to move against Quinn by tomorrow." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, relief washing through her. "I can hardly believe it. Believe it." Roy wrapped an arm around her. "You'll be home soon." "Home," Catherine repeated, the words suddenly complicated by new feelings. She turned to face him. "Roy, when this is over." He waited, his eyes searching hers. "When this is over, I don't want to go back to Rose Creek alone." The words rushed out, her heart pounding. "These past weeks, despite everything, the danger, my father's death, they've brought you into my life, and I don't want to lose that." "I don't want to lose you." Roy's expression softened. He reached up to trace the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. Catherine rose. "I've been alone in these mountains for 5 years, convincing myself it was what I wanted. Then I found you bleeding behind a boulder, pointing a gun at my chest, and suddenly being alone didn't make sense anymore." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her mother's wedding ring. "I'm not going anywhere you don't want me to go." Catherine closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that held promise, longing, and the healing of old wounds. This time, there was no hesitation from either of them as the kiss deepened, arms entwining and the world narrowing to just the two of them in their small attic sanctuary. Later, as they lay together in the narrow bed, Catherine's head resting on Roy's chest, she told him about her dreams for the ranch, the improvements her father had planned, the Appaloosa breeding program she wanted to establish, the orchard she hoped to plant in the sheltered valley. "It sounds like paradise," Roy murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "It could be," Catherine said, lifting her head to look at him. With the right partner, the smile that spread across Roy's face was answer enough. Their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Roy was on his feet instantly, reaching for his gun as a bottle crashed through their window, flames erupting as it hit the floor. "Fire bomb," Roy shouted, grabbing for his pants. "We need to get out now." Catherine scrambled for her clothes, coughing as smoke filled the small room. Roy kicked the flaming bottle toward the stone hearth, but the fire had already caught the rag rug and was spreading quickly. The stairs. Catherine pointed, but as they reached the door, they heard heavy footsteps pounding up from below. "Back window," Roy decided, grabbing their important possessions, the deed, his journal, Catherine's mother's locket that she'd kept in her pocket. They rushed to the rear window that overlooked an alley. "It's too far to jump," Catherine said, staring down at the cobblestones below. Roy was already ripping the sheets from the bed, knotting them together. "Old trick," he explained, tying one end to the heavy iron bedstead. "Not elegant, but it'll work." The makeshift rope barely reached halfway to the ground, but it was their only option as smoke filled the attic and the sound of men searching the lower floors grew louder. "You first," Roy insisted, helping Catherine out the window. She hesitated, suddenly terrified of leaving him behind. "I'll be right behind you," he promised, his eyes intense. "Go, Catherine." Hand over hand, she descended the knotted sheets, her heart in her throat. When she reached the end, she had no choice but to let go, falling the remaining distance. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but managed to stay upright. "Roy," she called upward, watching anxiously as he climbed out the window just as flames appeared behind him. He was halfway down when the sheet began to tear. Catherine watched in horror as the fabric ripped and Roy fell, landing with a heavy thud on the cobblestones. "Roy!" She rushed to his side, terrified by how still he lay. To her immense relief, he groaned, attempting to sit up. "My leg," he grimaced, his face pale with pain. "Think it's broken." The sound of shouts from the front of the building spurred Catherine to action. "We need to move." She helped Roy to his feet, supporting his weight as he hopped on his good leg. They staggered down the alley, Roy fighting through obvious agony with each movement. Catherine spotted a stable at the end of the lane and made for it, praying for shelter or horses, anything to help them escape. The stable was mercifully empty of people, though half a dozen horses watched their entrance with mild interest. Catherine helped Roy to a pile of hay before quickly examining the animals. "We need to get to the marshal," Roy said through gritted teeth, his face shining with sweat. "First, I need to splint that leg." Catherine had selected a sturdy-looking bay and was already searching for tack. "There's no time," Roy argued, but Catherine was already ripping strips from her petticoat and looking for straight sticks. "If we try to ride with your leg loose, you'll pass out from pain," she said firmly. "Give me 2 minutes." She worked quickly, using skills learned from years on the ranch. The splint was crude but functional, immobilizing Roy's lower leg between 2 straight branches and wrapped tightly with fabric. "You're good at this," Roy observed, his breathing a little easier once the leg was stabilized. Had practice with injured ranch hands. Catherine finished securing the last knot. "How's that feel?" "Like my leg's still broken, but less likely to kill me." His attempt at humor didn't hide the pain in his eyes, but his gaze was clear. "Let's go." Getting Roy onto the horse was a challenge that left them both sweating and him pale from pain. Catherine mounted behind him, taking the reins around his body. Marshall's office is 3 streets over, Roy directed, leaning back against her as she urged the horse forward. They had barely emerged from the alley when a shot rang out, splintering the wooden sign above their heads. Catherine yanked the reins, turning the horse as 2 men on horseback appeared at the far end of the street. Quinn's men. Roy recognized them immediately. Head for the courthouse. Catherine kicked the horse into a gallop, weaving through Helena's streets with Quinn's men in pursuit. More shots rang out, townspeople scattering in panic. She felt Roy fumbling for his gun. "Don't," she shouted over the wind. "You'll fall." The courthouse came into view, but so did Jasper Quinn himself, blocking the street with 3 more men. Catherine pulled up sharply, looking frantically for an escape route. "There!" Roy pointed to a narrow passage between buildings. She guided their mount into the alley, but it was too tight for a galloping horse. They were forced to slow to a walk, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Dead end, Catherine realized with horror as they approached a high fence blocking the alley. Roy was already sliding from the horse, nearly collapsing when his broken leg touched ground. "Help me to that doorway," he directed, nodding toward a recessed entrance. "We'll make our stand there." Catherine dismounted, supporting him as they hobbled to the doorway. Roy pressed his revolver into her hand. 6 shots, make them count. She checked the chambers with practiced ease, and he produced a small derringer from his boot. 2 shots, saved for special occasions. His grim smile didn't reach his eyes. The approaching hoofbeats slowed as their pursuers realized the trap had closed. Catherine steeled herself, thinking of her father, of all Quinn had taken. "Well now, isn't this cozy?" Quinn's mocking voice echoed down the alley as he dismounted. A stocky man in his 50s with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, he approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. The Rose girl and her protector, cornered like rats. "Stay back, Quinn," Catherine warned, raising the revolver. Quinn laughed, his men spreading out behind him. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, girl, and expense." His eyes narrowed. "The deed, if you please, then maybe I'll let you both live." "We know what your promises are worth," Roy said, his voice steady despite his injury. "The marshal knows everything. Killing us won't change that." A flash of uncertainty crossed Quinn's face before he masked it with bravado. "Marshal Donovan is busy with a fire across town. Tragic accident." He stepped closer. "The deed. Now," Catherine cocked the hammer. "One more step and you'll join my father." Quinn froze, genuine surprise in his expression. "You've got spirit, girl. Your father had the same foolish pride." His hand moved toward his own gun. "Too bad it got him killed too." Everything happened at once, Quinn reaching for his weapon, Catherine squeezing the trigger, Roy shoving her sideways as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. She fell hard, the revolver flying from her grip, expecting to feel the burn of bullets. Instead, she heard new voices shouting commands, saw Quinn and his men raising their hands as Marshal Donovan and a half-dozen deputies swarmed the alley from both ends. "Cavalry's here," Roy said weakly from beside her, a smile touching his pale lips. "Right on time." Catherine turned to him in relief, then gasped in horror. Blood was spreading across his shirt from a bullet wound in his side. "Roy, no." She pressed her hands against the wound, panic rising as warm blood seeped between her fingers. "Help, he's shot." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Roy was carried to the doctor's office, Catherine refusing to leave his side despite the marshal's desire to take her statement. The doctor worked quickly, removing the bullet and stitching the wound with practiced efficiency. "He's lucky," the doctor told Catherine as Roy lay unconscious, pale but breathing steadily. "Bullet missed the vital organs. With proper care and rest, he should recover fully." "And his leg?" Catherine asked, clutching Roy's limp hand. "Clean break. It'll heal." The doctor patted her shoulder kindly. "Your husband is a strong man." Catherine didn't correct the assumption, too relieved by the prognosis to care about such details. Marshal Donovan appeared later, his expression grave but satisfied. "Quinn and his men are in custody," he reported. With the witnesses we've gathered and the evidence of this attack, they'll hang for certain. He placed a folded document on the bedside table. This is a court order restoring full ownership of Rose Creek Ranch to you, Miss Rose. Judge Wilson's replacement signed it this morning. Catherine stared at the paper, victory feeling hollow with Roy lying injured beside her. Thank you, Marshal. You can return home whenever you're ready. The Marshal glanced at Roy, though I suspect that may be a while. Yes, Catherine agreed softly. I'm not leaving without him. For 2 weeks, Catherine rarely left Roy's bedside as he recovered from his wounds. The broken leg would take months to heal completely, but the bullet wound improved steadily under the doctor's care. As Roy's strength returned, they made plans for their future together. The ranch will need rebuilding in places, Catherine said one afternoon as she helped Roy practice walking with crutches. Quinn's men weren't known for their housekeeping skills. We can handle it, Roy assured her, his balance improving with each step. I'm pretty handy with a hammer when I'm not getting shot, Catherine laughed, the sound still feeling new after so much sorrow. And your cabin, will you miss it? Roy stopped, turning to face her. The cabin was just a place to hide from life, Catherine. I'm done hiding. Her heart swelled with emotion. Good, because Rose Creek Ranch needs a man who can see the soul of things. And so do I. When they finally left Helena a month after the confrontation with Quinn, they traveled by stagecoach rather than horseback, Roy's splinted leg making riding impossible. The journey took them through familiar territory, past Roy's mountain cabin where they stopped briefly to collect his few cherished possessions and say goodbye to Mabel. Always knew you'd find your way back to the living, the older woman said, embracing Roy fiercely before turning to Catherine. You take care of this one. He's worth the trouble. I know, Catherine replied, her hand finding Roy's. They reached Rose Creek Ranch on a crisp November afternoon, the land spread before them in autumn glory. Despite Quinn's occupation, the main house still stood, though the outbuildings showed neglect. A few horses remained in the corral, including Catherine's favorite mare, who whinnied in recognition as they approached. Standing on her family's porch, Catherine felt a complex mixture of grief for her father and hope for the future. Roy hobbled to her side, his arms slipping around her waist. Welcome home, he said softly. Catherine turned to him, taking in his steady gaze and the quiet strength that had become her anchor. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her mother's wedding ring that she'd worn through all their trials. Roy Archer, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I have nothing to offer you but this ring and a broken-down ranch that needs more work than either of us may live to complete. Roy's eyes widened as she held out the ring. Catherine, I'm not giving it to you as payment, she hurried on. Because I know now that the most precious things can't be bought or sold. I'm offering it as a promise that whatever comes, we face it together. Roy took her hands in his, the ring glowing between them in the afternoon light. You don't owe me anything, Catherine Rose, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But if you're asking what I think you're asking, then yes. 1,000 times yes. I'm asking you to marry me, Catherine confirmed, tears of joy spilling onto her cheeks. To build a life here with me. Roy's answer was to pull her into his arms, his kiss sealing the promise between them as the Montana sun bathed Rose Creek Ranch in golden light. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in the nearest town, Mabel serving as Catherine's matron of honor, and the marshal making a special trip from Helena to stand with Roy. The ranch hands who had fled Quinn's takeover began to return, drawn by word that Catherine Rose had reclaimed her father's legacy and brought home a husband who treated workers fairly and knew the value of the land. Over the winter, as snow blanketed Rose Creek and Roy's legs slowly healed, they planned the future of the ranch together. Catherine's vision for Appaloosa breeding merged with Roy's practical knowledge of the mountains and forests. They expanded the orchards in the sheltered valley and reinforced the irrigation systems that made Rose Creek's water rights so valuable. By spring, When the wildflowers carpeted the meadows and new foals wobbled beside their mothers in the pasture, Catherine knew a contentment deeper than any she had imagined possible after the tragedy of her father's death. Each evening, as she and Roy sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains, she would touch the simple gold band on her finger, not her mother's ring, which now resided in a cherished keepsake box, but a new one Roy had surprised her with on their wedding day. "What are you thinking?" Roy asked one such evening, his arm comfortable around her shoulders, his leg finally free of its splint though he still walked with a slight limp. Catherine smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about boulders and bleeding shoulders and a stranger who expected no payment for saving my life." Roy chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Catherine agreed, taking his hand and placing it gently over her stomach where their first child had just begun to grow a secret she had been waiting for the perfect moment to share. Roy's expression shifted from confusion to wonder as he understood her meaning. "Catherine, are you?" She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. "In the autumn. Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday." The look of pure happiness that transformed Roy's face was everything Catherine had hoped for. He gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were more precious than all the gold in Montana territory. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "For what? For everything. For pointing a gun at me, for being stubborn enough to survive, for loving me back to life." Roy drew back to look into her eyes. "For our future." As the sun sank behind the mountains and the first stars appeared above Rose Creek Ranch, Catherine Rose Archer knew she had found something far more valuable than land or water rights, or even her father's legacy. She had found a love that had transformed loss into hope, vengeance into justice, and two wounded souls into a family. And it had all begun with a gunshot, a bleeding shoulder, and a cowboy who had said simply and truly, "You don't owe me."